Welcome back to English 102, Composition 2. Today we come to one of the most critical strategies for developing a thesis, integrating quotes from primary and secondary sources into your own text, your own paper. As with the other aspects of writing a thesis-driven essay, it's useful to know what the purpose of quoting is. Essentially, the purpose of quoting is to provide concrete development of your thesis in the form of expert testimony, if you will, from other sources. Whereas invention and discovery strategies bring the writer's own voice decisively into play, research is intended to bring the informed and therefore persuasive voices of others into the writing moment in support of the writer's voice. In persuasive discourse, this is a critical, if not essential, rhetorical strategy. Therefore, using quotes to develop your thesis is probably the most important aspect of providing concrete development in the body of your essay. It requires a number of research skills to locate these quotable content. To efficiently locate and effectively utilize information in this manner, the student researcher needs therefore to possess a cluster of abilities as follows: to identify and access the needed information, to evaluate, assess the information and its sources critically, to extract the information, to incorporate the selected information into your own text, to document the sources of the information, and finally, to disseminate it to your peers in the form of a paper. More specifically, this research process strengthens and utilizes another cluster of abilities as follows: development of a research plan or strategy, identification or definition of key terms, development of information retrieval strategies, development of a system for organizing the information that is extracted or gathered, development of information extraction skills, identifying critical gaps in the research base, developing the ability to summarize or paraphrase the words of another, development of discipline-specific citation skills, whether these are MLA, APA, or Chicago, development of a working bibliography throughout the research process, and development of critical assessment abilities regarding the validity, reliability, and relevancy of the sources, as well as the strengths and weaknesses of a source's argument. How then can the academic writer effectively integrate quoted material into his or her own text? There are several effective rhetorical strategies for accomplishing this splice between another's words and your own. 5, in fact, each of which I will model. Weaving any quote into your text involves a simple 3-step process as follows. First, introduce the quote in your own words. Second, reproduce the quote word for word, including its punctuation, followed by a page number in parentheses and a period. And third, explicate or further develop the significance of this quote or the implications of it. Read between the lines, as it were, of its meaning. Note, when first quoting from a given source, you must also mention the author's full name and the full title of the work, either in your introduction of the quote or in the parenthetical reference to it. Thereafter, you could simply refer to it by page number or by a one-word abbreviation of the title or the author's name. A pitfall to be aware of and to be avoided. Your paper can have no freestanding quotes. This is an absolute rule. Nowhere in the body of your paper, in the introduction body or your conclusion, can you have a quote that is simply a sentence by itself. Every quote must be integrated or introduced in your own words. There is one exception, and this is under the title. If you have a quote that you want to include, it doesn't need to be introduced by your own words. It does, however, need the parenthetical citation after it. This is usually handled in a single space quote. That's the only exception to this rule of no freestanding quotes. Here's an example of what I'm talking about from a student paper. This quote appeared as a sentence by itself with the proper parenthetical page reference, but it violated the rule by not having any words introducing it. The problem is easily solved. You just simply introduce it with your own words, mentioning the author. As Chin and Golnick assert, comma, and then include the quote. Now that quote is coupled to your words and therefore no longer considered to be freestanding. There are 5 ways to handle your introduction or attribution of a quote in order to achieve that seamless splice between another's words and your own. The most common by far is to simply introduce the quote in your own words in which you mention the author, followed then by the quote and the parenthetical reference. You might simply write, as Jones states, comma, and then give the quote and the parenthetical reference. A variation of this is just to reverse the order. Begin with the quote, followed by the author attribution in your own words. A third variation is to break the quote in two and insert the author attribution in your own words between the two halves of the quote. A fourth variation is to use a keyword quote in which you're just quoting a few key words as opposed to the entire sentence. And finally, a fifth way to integrate quotes into your text is to use a block quote. And we'll get to the rules regarding block quotes in a minute. Of these 5, by far the most common and useful is the first, the author introduction followed by the quote. I found a simple introductory clause with multiple variations on it to be the most effective means of integrating a quote into my own text as follows. For example, a quote by Goethe that architecture is frozen music might simply be introduced as Goethe states, comma, and then the quote, I call architecture frozen music. The problem is if you use that phrase, states, every time, it will begin to sound like a broken record because of its repetitiveness or redundancy. So simply use a series of other words in place of states. For example, as Goethe observes, as Goethe asserts, as Goethe affirms, avers, argues, writes, attests, notes, etc. This will lend some variety to your writing. And as in life, variety is the spice of writing. Again, it is important to note that introducing a quote with a clause, such as Goethe states, requires a comma, whereas introducing a quote with a complete sentence necessitates a colon. The next section will go into greater detail regarding this process of quoting and integrating source material into your own words.